Today, there is a tremendous amount of misinformation and misunderstanding about marriage. And of course, what we're talking about is Christian family, the way God wanted it to be. During this first hour, we're going to spend a considerable amount of time talking about the way things are. And the way things are is not necessarily the way things are supposed to be. But this is the way things are, and we have to sometimes accept that aspect of it and also have to live with it. And the thing of it is just like the neighborhood in which we live, we can choose our house, but we can't choose our neighbors sometimes. It's that way in the family. Sometimes you can choose your spouse, but you can't choose their other relatives in the family. You're kind of attached to a whole group of people. Nobody ever marries just one person. They marry into a family, and they become a part of a family, an extended family, and that happens on both sides. I think I got the better deal probably on the situation with my wife and I. Her family is such a wonderful group of people, but she has loved my family, and they have loved her, and I'm thankful for that too. But it's that way. You can choose some things, but there's some things you can't choose. You can make decisions for yourself, but you can't always make decisions for other people. And that's what makes life a bit of an adventure. That may be a better way to look at it than a discouragement, but a bit of an adventure. And life is that way, an adventure. We're going to be looking at a lot of statistics during this first hour. I probably spent more time researching this through the various means that I have to do research than I had some of the others, because the others do not change, but this changes. And what was true 10 years ago and what's true today is different. In fact, as we'll see, there are many fewer abortions today than there were 10 years ago. There's fewer marriages today than there were 10 years ago. There are fewer divorces because there are fewer marriages than there were 10 years ago. Things are changing. We're on page 2. The legal definition of marriage has evolved over the past 2 decades, and that culminated in the U.S. Supreme Court's Obergefell decision in June 2015. But what about Americans personally? How do they view marriage? How they personally do it? From a list of options, half choose a covenant before God between a man and a woman. Half the people choose the biblical definition as best representing their view of marriage. The traditional Christian definition is not equally popular across age groups. However, elders are 19 percentage points more than millennials. That is, folks that are above 70, 65, and 70 hold the view much more strongly than people who are 18 to 29. And so you have that aspect. And they prefer this definition. 61%, the older ones do, and only about 42% hold the Christian view of marriage. Boomers are at 54%. They're still the majority. And Generation Xers at 52% fall between the oldest and the youngest generations. So you've got a lot of different views, but you can see that the older you are, the more likely you're to hold to the biblical view of marriage. And the younger you get, the less likely you are to hold to that view. And a lot of it is because of the change in our culture. To say that the biblical view that marriage is only between a man and a woman is not held by the youngest group in the majority, but 42%. As one might expect, there are religious differences on this question as well. For example, practicing Christians choose the traditional definition by a wide margin, while Americans with no faith, that would be those who are the nones, N-O-N-E-S, that is people who have no religious affiliation, prefer to define marriage as a civil agreement between 2 adults of any gender, and that would be 52% of them. The nones, the people who have no religious affiliation, now make up 29% of the population of the United States. It used to be in 1993 about 8%. In 2016, that figure had gotten up to about 23%. Today, it's about 29%. And so it has grown as the time has grown. It has been one of the fastest growing demographical changes in our nation of people who are no longer affiliated. There are a lot of people who are unmarried in the United States. I think this one might surprise you. The census report indicated that in 2021, there are now 122 million Americans who are divorced or widowed or have always been single. That is, they're unmarried people. Previously, I charted, according to the source that I had, he says, I charted the number of unmarried Americans from 1970 through 2019. In 1970, there were 38 million unmarried Americans, accounting for 28% of the people 18 and older. By 2019, the number increased to 118 million, amounting to 47%, with the new number of 122 million unmarried Americans in 2021. The percentage is inching even closer to half at 48.2%. Other reports suggest higher percentages of unmarried Americans if they count people starting at age 15 rather than 18. In 2019, adults who had always been single made up 62% of all unmarried Americans. But in 2021, lifelong single people, called never married by the Census Bureau, comprised 63%. In 2019, 26% of unmarried Americans were divorced or separated. You see, it's not 50% of all the people who marry. It's not really that big. And 13% were widowed. In 2021, those percentages were 25 and 12. So there are fewer in that category. Well, I thought we'd look at the number of same-sex marriages, since that has been such a big deal in recent years. In the last decade, the number of same-sex married households more than quadrupled in the last decade. Same-sex couples were 1.2% of all households. With married couples, there are about 125 million households. So we're talking about a little over a million same-sex couples. We're not talking about a huge number. But it was 1.2% of all households in 2021. These numbers have continued to increase consistently over the past decades, and they have. Now, following the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision of 2022, which overturned the constitutional right to an abortion, a bill was proposed in the House of Representatives to federally regulate the right to same-sex and interracial marriage. This bill, titled Respect for Marriage Act, passed the Senate with the revisions on November 29, 2022. And the Respect for Marriage Act repeals the Defense of Marriage Act, which was signed back in the early 2000s, or back in the late 1900s, which defined marriage between one man and one woman. It also requires states and federal government to respect gay marriages in the states where it is legal. So there is this kind of standing. Now, these are things you need to know if you're dealing with people as they come here and go there. Every state is different. Every state has a right to make some of its own laws with regard to marriage. What age you can have marriage without your parents' consent. In 1973, I was 20 years old, and I performed, 1972. I was 19 years old, and I performed 2 wedding ceremonies before I was 21 years old. In the state of Oklahoma, if you were under the age of 21, if you were a female, it was 18. But if it were younger than 21 and a male, you had to have your parents' signature on the wedding agreement license on the application before you could be given a marriage license. So I want you to know that I performed 2 weddings before I was old enough to get married myself without my daddy's signature. Yeah, anybody who is a preacher has to look at the laws and how they change from place to place. In the state of Oklahoma, I have in my pocket my ability to do marriages. I have a thing that gives me, that was from 1972 in Pottawatomie County in the state of Oklahoma, that permitted me to perform a wedding ceremony. And it's dated this 7th day of June, 1972. And it was signed by the court clerk. And I had to have the endorsement of a church to be able to do that. And I took a letter in, and and anytime I do a wedding, I have to give not only the county where the book was that gave me that permission, the book number and the book page. So I carry this card. I haven't done a wedding in quite some time, and probably won't do too many in days to come. But maybe when the kids get a little older. But it's different in states. I've done weddings in Texas, and I didn't have to have any of those things. Spam. We will end that business. Anyway, I was in Texas, or if I was in Mississippi, I did not have to have any, nor in Tennessee did I have to have any, but I did one in Arkansas a number of years ago. When I was in Texarkana, I could do weddings in Texas, or I could do weddings in Arkansas, because we had members that lived in both states. If I was in Arkansas, I had to have registration, and I have a letter that registers me to do weddings in Arkansas. So what I'm saying is that it does differ. The laws of marriage do differ from state to state. They're not the same. That's all I wanted to point out from that. There are 37 million one-person households. That's how many were in 2021. That's 28% of all households are one-person households, like my daughter down in Texas. In 1960, single-person households represented only 13% of households. So one of the things the church needs to think about is that the growth of the number of people who are single and providing single programs is really a big, big deal. And a church that provides those kinds of things can really make a difference. There are a lot of single people who are extremely lonely. And finding something for them would be a thing. So one of the things that I wanted to point out is that's one of the things that needs to be looked at as you're thinking about what you're going to do with the growth of the church. The number of families with their own children, that were of the father and of the mother of that household, under the age of 18 in a household declined over the last 2 decades. In 2021, 40% of all U.S. families lived with their own children, compared to 44% in 2011 and 48% in 2001. So less than half of the households in America have people who are living with their children. Marriage. In 2021, 34% of adults age 15 and over have never been married. That's 34%. And that's up 23% from 23% in 1950. So 15 and over, that's pretty young. I married at 22. My wife was 19, almost 20. A lot of people married much younger. Today, many marriages don't take place until the late 20s. That's the average age of marriage is much older than it used to be. The median age to marry for the first time was 30.4 for men and 28.6 for women in early 2021, up from ages 23 and 20, respectively, in 1947. In 2021, less than 1/4 of children under age 15 living in married couple families had a stay-at-home mother, compared to 1% that had a stay-at-home father. I thought that was interesting. Marriage rates in America. Marriage rates in the U.S. have continuously declined for several decades. In 2018, the marriage rate was 31.3 per thousand unmarried women, with a 6.5 average for both genders. In 2019, there were over 2 million registered marriages, making the marriage rate even lower at 6.1. I guess that's a percent there. In 2020, it dropped even lower to 5.1%. 2021, 67.54 million men and 68.33 million women were married in the United States. Now, that may sound like a funny thing that there are more married women than there are married men, but let me mention that women are more likely to marry women, that among the same-sex marriages, women are more likely to marry than same-sex than men are. There are more women who classify as lesbian than there are men who classify as gay. I do not know why, but that has been the case for some time. The average length of marriage in the United States is 8.2 years. Although the national average for marriage in the United States is slightly over 8 years, couples in West Virginia and Maine have the longest lasting unions, 22, according to research. Many resources estimate the U.S. divorce rate to be about 50%. But the actual percentages of marriages that end in divorce vary between 40 to 50. For those who fear their marriage will end in divorce, this statistic is reassuring and suggests they are more likely to stay married than divorced. However, we'll talk about this more at length in a little bit later time, toward the end of the, probably tomorrow night. Yeah.
I don't mean to be rude to cut you off though, but that's the way the world's going. And from your age into my age range, do we ever suspect that some of these kids are they getting taught the values of love and Christian values in the home? See, that's the thing that I see a lot today. That a lot of kids, they either, excuse me, for to get molested, or they have bad parents, or the parents are just being sick. Parents are not teaching their kids.
I understand that, and you're exactly right on target. We have had situations where now there have been 3 or 4 generations of people who found it to be advantageous not to marry. And I was talking to one of the prison ministers just the other day, and he was talking about this particular man that he worked with that was in his prison ministry. And the guy had 17 children, an 18th on the way. And he said 3 of them were born the same year and were the same age. Well, this man had never heard the gospel, had never been taught. This is something that has hurt. In 1950, in the early 50s, only about 6% of the children that were growing up then grew up without any spiritual education. Today, that number is probably half the children growing up. Over 40% of the children who are born in the United States, and this has been true for some little time, since the last 20 years, over 40% of the children born in the United States are born to mamas and daddies who are not married to each other. If they're not married to each other, very likely they're not getting much spiritual education. So, yes, I'm very well aware, and you're exactly on target for what you're saying.
And another thing, nothing against the women, though, I feel like women have more of a nurturing nature. So it's kind of fun. I'm going to say this and not trying to be cocky about it, be young, but I feel like as a man, you can be a dirty man, Christian man, good man, bad man. And I don't know if you ever came around a household, they tell you, well, hey, you dress up, put some cologne on, and go on a date. You really too much don't hear that from the mother's side of the point for a woman. You know, they tell a woman if she's on a date, make sure you cross your leg, make sure you don't put yourself out like that. So if you think about it, it's more anchored to us to have more women than women have more men. Because
well, society has always felt like it was all right for a man to have a multiple number of women, where it was never right for a woman to have that. And that's been true in many societies through the ages. And it's an unfortunate that it's that way. What I'm trying to do is describe how life is in this country. And that's what I'm trying to describe. But what you have brought up is very much the case. And the thing of it is people who've grown up going to church and people who've had a spiritual heritage really have no foundation for fully understanding people who've grown out without any spiritual education at all. When I was a camp director in Mississippi for a number of years, we would have 80 kids come to camp, And I would say maybe a third of those kids who came to camp, most of them came from Christian homes, but a lot of them did not come from Christian homes.
Right.
And many of them, the only spiritual education they got was what they got from us at camp during that year or at VBS, because their parents would say, go. But that's the kind of situation that we have. We're going to go down into the living arrangements, and this is a little bit of what we're talking about. Here we have a different situation where there is a man and a woman living in the same household, but they're not married. Many resources estimate, well, we talked about that. The living arrangements, this is on page 4. Some living arrangement differed by sex and age group in 2021. The percentage of men and women ages 18 to 24 that lived alone, about 5% each, did not significantly differ. More women than men in this age group lived with a spouse, 7% and 4% respectively. The percentages of men ages 18 to 24 living alone was not significantly different from the percentage of men who lived with a spouse. A greater share of women than men, 7% in this age, also lived with an unmarried partner. Men and women ages 25 to 34 were more likely than their younger peers to live with a spouse or unmarried partner, that is cohabiting. 1/3, 33% of men and 42% of women lived with a spouse in early 2021, but the same share, 17% of both men and women of these ages lived with an unmarried partner. They were shacking up. These patterns were likely related to the lower median age of women, 28.6, than men at first marriage. But you're having a whole lot more of unmarried parents. And many of these unmarried parents are not teenagers. They're people in their 20s and 30s. Many unmarried mothers are in their 20s and 30s, not teenagers. And that may be surprising, but that's kind of the way things are. In 2021, one half, that is 58% of adults aged 18 to 24, lived in their parental home. And there were 2 reasons for that. Number one is you can get insurance on your mom and daddy till you're age 26. When you turn 27, you're in trouble. You have to have insurance for yourself. And there are a lot of 27-year-old young adults who are really struggling to have some kind of health care right now. And so you have that kind of stuff. There are a lot of children in single-parent families. This is page 5. In the United States today, nearly 24 million children live in a single-parent home. This total, which has been rising for half a century, covers about 1 in every 3 kids across America at this point. A number of long-term demographic trends have fueled this increase, including marrying later, declining marriage rates, increasing divorce rates, and an uptick in babies born to single mothers. Within single-parent families, most children, 15 million, live in a mother-only household. Nearly 6 million kids live with cohabiting parents. Some 3 to 4 million kids live with a father-only household, according to 2019 estimates. Among unmarried parents, the share of single mothers has shrunk in recent decades, while the share of cohabiting parents has grown. So there's a man in the household with a woman, but they're not married to each other. And so a child is born sometimes with that. There are many challenges of single parents. This is not to pick on single parents. This is just to talk about these are how things are. A number of factors have fueled the rise in single-parent families. For instance, more people are opting to marry later in life, skip marriage altogether, or have kids outside of marriage. At the same time, marriages have grown more likely to end in divorce. More than 20% of children born to married couples will experience a divorce by age 9, and more than 50% of kids born to cohabiting couples, now did you see the difference? Will experience a parental breakup according to some estimates. So a cohabiting couple is more likely to split than a married couple. Transitioning to a single-parent household can disrupt a child's routines, education, housing arrangements, and family income. It can also intensify the incidence of parental conflict and stress. And these changes can be very difficult and even traumatic for some children. Compared to kids in married parent households, children And single-parent families are more likely to experience poor outcomes. While the research is complex, sometimes contradictory, and evolving, mounting evidence indicates that underlying factors, that strong and stable relationships, parental mental health and socioeconomic status, and access to resources have a greater impact on a child's success than does family structure alone. But children thrive when they have a safe, stable, and nurturing environment. There are a lot of single parents that are single through no fault of their own, and they deserve our support and our love and our help as much as possible. And there are a lot of people that lose a loved one. You know, there's a lot of single mothers that daddy's in jail, or single daddies and mothers in jail. We used to call orphans' homes. They don't call them orphans' homes anymore because most of the children who are in a children's home either have parents, maybe one parent has died and the other is in prison, or maybe both are in prison, or they're too sick to take care of the child. But a lot of times the parents are living. It could be that they're on drugs and incapable of taking care of the kids. And so the court puts them into a home to take care of them. And there's just a lot of that kind of thing in our world today. We ask, what is the divorce rate in the U.S.? The national average divorce rate in the U.S. in 2020 was 2.3 per 1,000 people. As the Center for Disease Control reported, it's almost 64% lower than the average of 3.6 per 1,000 people in 2010. Now, part of the reason for that is we have fewer people getting married. The number of people marrying. Now, this excludes data from California, Georgia, Hawaii, Indiana, Louisiana, and Minnesota. So you have to remember there are 5 or 6 states that don't have this, but for the other states, it does have it. In 2019, the CDC reported almost 2.7 divorces per 1,000 people. And of course, it's come down a little bit now to 2.3. The Centers for Disease Control also reported 630,505 total divorces in 2020. The divorce rate in America in 2021 was estimated to be around 45% before COVID. However, by mid-2021, several legal professionals noticed an increase in divorce filings. COVID may have caused some of that, most likely due to restrictions being eased. That could be part of it too. As a result, in 2022, some sources predict the divorce rate to reach at least 44.2%. This comes from divorce.com, and they had a lot of facts and figures. This was October 28, 2022. That's only 3 or 4 months ago. United States Census Bureau reports suggest that marriage and divorce rates dropped from 2009 to 2019. Usually second or third marriages in the United States have a higher divorce rate. 60% of second marriages and about 73% of third marriages end in divorce. We had an extended family member, I'll not tell on which side or what, but I think when he died, we didn't know whether he had been married 7 or 8 times. And when I was doing the funeral, the current wife had written this really wonderful love poem for the one who had passed away. And she wanted me to read it during the service. I decided that I would not, since 3 of his former wives were sitting out in the group. But see, that's the world. That's the world in which we live. And it may not be the majority, but this is a situation that takes place. Wouldn't you like to do a funeral like that? Couples going through their first divorce are around the age of 30. Married couples between the ages of 20 and 25 are 60% likely to get a divorce. Couples who marry real young often have. That was not true in years ago, but it is very true often this day and time. Marriage is not for children. It's for grown-ups. It's for people who are grown up and willing to take responsibility. What age group has the highest divorce rate? Well, married couples within the ages of 15 and 24 are more likely to divorce than any other age group. Now, this is why the average length of marriage is 8.2 years. It's because many of these younger ones divorce very early. Looking at the combined data for 2017, the 15 to 24 age group had a divorce rate of 27 per thousand people who were currently married. More recently, adults 29 to 39 had a divorce rate of 24 per thousand. For 40 to 49, it was 21 per thousand. In 2019, divorce rate for adults 50 and older was 10 per thousand. So the older you get, the less likely you are to divorce. My wife has put up with me, and there's hope for me yet. We'll hit the 50-year mark next May, not this coming May, but a year from May. We'll hit the 50-year mark. And I've been married to the same old girl a long time. Divorce among that age group, 50 and years of age and older, continues to rise. It is more than it used to be. The rate of divorce for those 50 and older has more than doubled since 1990. Furthermore, divorce among those 50 and older is more likely for persons married multiple times before or married for fewer years. Then there are statistics. These are the national divorce rates by number of years of marriage: 20% by the first 5 years, 32% in the first 10 years, 48% of spouses who married before the age of 18 are likely to divorce within 10 years, and 25% of spouses over 25 years of age get a divorce within 10 years. So the difference between waiting just a little bit before you marry is a big difference. Divorce rate for first and second marriages. The rate of divorce increases in relation to the number of times married. Those who remarry are 2.5 times more likely to divorce. Divorce from first marriage, 8 years is the average length. And this period represents a divorce rate of about 50%. And of course, when they're real young, that happens. Divorce from second marriage, the average length of second marriages is just under 8 years. This represents a divorce rate of about 67%. And the divorce rate for third marriages is about 75%. Let me just mention that that's not always true. I've known many people who are involved in second marriages, that their marriages lasted till death do us part. I can think of my wife's parents, and I can think of my parents. And they both lasted till death do us part. And that happens. Sometimes it doesn't happen that this is one of these things, but again, this is something that's there. In what year of marriage is divorce most common? Of the 39% to 50% of marriages ending in divorce, the average length of marriage is 8 years. That old thing about the 7-year itch has some validity to it. I don't know why. But there was a movie put out in the 50s, I think, with that name. A Pew Forum survey released in November 2010 said 39% of Americans say that marriage is obsolete. I thought that was a shocking fact. Now, this change in thinking profoundly impacts our country and especially children. In 1960, 72% of adults in America were married. But in 2008, only 52% were married. And now it's probably less than 50%, right at that. Many are willing to wait until later in life to marry, and the number of single people who are divorced has tripled since 1960. God gave Eve to Adam in the beginning because it was not good for him to be alone. Marriage that is one man and one woman for life was and is God's design. Jackie's parents told Jackie, said, look, you get into problems and you get unhappy, don't come home. Don't come home. Well, when we married for life. And that's what needs to be taught. One man, one woman for life. And let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. That's important. That argues against same-sex marriage. Because the word for man and the word for husband is the same word. And the word for woman and the word for wife is the same word in the original language. So let every man have his own woman, and every woman have her own wife, her own husband. Let every woman have her own husband. And we could go back and say, let every husband have his own wife and every wife have her own husband. That's the way it should be. That is the will of God. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2. And don't quote it the way I misquoted it. When I was a teenager growing up in Shawnee, Oklahoma in the 60s, we used a word that I don't hear much these days. And of course, that's the idea of the word fornication. And of course, that word was used by Jesus several times to talk about intercourse before marriage or outside of marriage. The word porneia that is used in the New Testament, porneia, and we get the word pornography from that. It just means a writing of porneia. That is, porneia is sex outside of marriage. And it's any kind of thing. It can be a young couple who are not yet married, a man and a woman, or it could be two men who have sex with each other. It could be two girls who have sex with each other. It could be, when someone says, oh, the Bible never condemns homosexuality, they have not really taken time to look at the word porneia, because Jesus certainly shows that porneia is a sin. And anyway, those are the kinds of things that have taken place with regard to the world we live in. And I hear this ever so often, that we have nothing in the Bible. Jesus never said anything about homosexuality. Yes, he did when he talked about porneia. Because in those days, someone who had mentioned a word such as that would have understood that it would refer to incest. It would refer to bestiality. I mean, just every kind of gross thing you can think of. That's what the word porneia would include. And so that's important. Today, nearly 60% of American adults believe that fornication or sex outside of marriage is morally acceptable. And Carl, you're right. There are an awful lot of people who don't even know that's wrong. They've never been taught that that is a sin against God. Only 40% think it's wrong to have sex outside of marriage.
I think from my standpoint, is much of a pleasurable thing. Because a lot of guys, buying y'all, who that girl, she look good. She got some nice hair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's man is lust is a big deal, and it's a big deal among women, just like it's a big deal among men.
I don't hear women talking about men like that category. Well,
I remember making a statement one time about men looking at women, and some girls popped up and said, "You don't know how girls talk to each other." It's a different kind of lust, but it's very much there, and that's the word that I want to use, lust. Now, let me just mention that lust, King James uses the word lasciviousness in Galatians 5, where it talks about the various works of the flesh, and he talks about adultery, he talks about fornication, and he talks about lasciviousness. Well, we have a lot of those four-letter words, lust, and some others that really are more the kind of words that we use. Lasciviousness is one of those $5 words we don't use much anymore. But basically, it means an illicit desire, sexual desire, that doesn't maybe include sex, but is there. For a man to look upon a woman and lust after her, even though he doesn't have sex with her, but to look upon a woman and to lust after her, in God's ways of thinking, he has committed adultery in his heart. This is Matthew chapter 5. I don't remember whether it's, I think it's 28 or 29 in that area. But that idea is very clearly taught. And it's from the heart that these kind of things come from that. But Colossians 3, 5 and following, and Galatians 5, 19 to 21 make it very clear that lasciviousness is a sin that if a person pursues and does not repent, that he will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's a pretty strong statement. Pretty strong statement. We need to teach our children that lasciviousness is what causes the fornication. that whenever they do that, kids go out on a date and how far should we go? And they start going farther than they should. And what happens is not long until they do more than they wish they had done. And then there's problems. And that's the way it goes. And those of you who have grown up and you know how things are, I won't need to explain all of that. But those are the kinds of things that took place. The woman at the well had 5 husbands, and now she had a man that she did not, that she was with, who was not her husband. Not her husband. That one, this man woman that you now have, who's not your husband, apparently suggests that she was living with that man. In 1 Corinthians 5, when you have this man who had his father's wife, and everybody knew about it, and they were a little bit arrogant about it, and they thought, oh boy, he's got his father's wife. And they thought that was something really good. And of course, God condemned that. And Paul said, I've judged that man. It was wrong. Well, what were they doing? They were cohabiting. And you have quite a number of people today that cohabit. The number of people cohabiting today is greater than it's ever been. You're talking about, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 or 13% of households are cohabiting. I remember Daniel one summer, probably early 2000s. I think I did 6 weddings. And what was shocking to me is that many of the weddings I was doing that summer, these folks were in their 20s, but there was no mistake that they had the same address. And one of them was a Christian, one was not, but that's still, they were living together. And I would say to them, okay, you're living together, and it seems to me, and from this evidence that you have of the same address. And I said, it's something you need to be aware of. If you want me to do your wedding, you need to live apart. I don't know what that means, but you need to live apart. And if you want me to do the wedding, you need to get your life right. And you need to live in separate places. And it was surprising that some of these kids grew up in good homes. They knew better, but they were living together. But that was so common in the culture. This was in the early 2000s. And the percentages of young couples that live together before they marry is very, very high. And if you have a cohabiting couple that lives together for a good little while and then marry, the chances of their having a divorce is much higher than otherwise. And a book that I suggested, I think that I had mentioned a little bit later on in this, is a book by Waite and Gallagher that talk about the problems that take place with cohabiting. And many of these things can be listed very carefully. We're about 10 minutes before 7. I'm going to let you read the rest of this, but I will say, down in the middle of page 8, it says that God cannot look on wickedness with favor, and God hasn't changed. The National Center for Health Statistics reports that 41%, that's 41% of births in America today, are to unwed mothers. In 1960, that was only 5%. The situation with cohabiting means that if somebody has a problem, the other person's not going to be there. They're going to be gone. There's not the covenant made between the two people to stay together. And that's an unfortunate thing. All right, we're going to stop here. We will start again on page 11, but I would encourage you, there's more here to read than I can go through in an oral way. But I think this last section, Is Marriage Obsolete?, was from a program that I did on Search to the Nation. And it drew a lot of response when I did that some years back. It needs to be done again one of these days. And cohabiting is a serious problem. Well, let's stop and have a prayer. Brother, would you lead us in prayer, please, sir?
God, our loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for all that you've done for us throughout our life. Thank you for this time we have for different class with Bill bringing his material to us so we can better understand how a marriage should be, how a family should be. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for Bill coming our way. Now, there's some food that people will be eating. We ask you to bless that food and nourish another. Bless us in thy service. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
During this second session, what I want to do is to spend a little time talking about God's plan for marriage. And we're looking at various passages, and we'll start, of course, in the book of Genesis, in the things that are there. One of those statements is in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image." It's interesting, he talks about let us make man, he's talking about man, but then he gets more specific, according to our likeness. And then he says, let them, he uses it in the plural, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. In chapter 2, verse 7, the Lord God formed man, that is Adam, of the dust of the ground, breathed in his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. We find out in verse 19, the Lord God said, it's not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. Now, this is not the first time that the woman is referred to. When you go back into Genesis, and this was not in the written part of this, but in Genesis 1, it says in verse 27 of chapter 1, and God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him, male and female, he created them. So we need to understand that it was not just male, but male and female. The idea that somehow chapter 1 is different than chapter 2, and that one group wrote 1 and another individual wrote 2 is just not true. Moses wrote both of them. What you have is a general statement in chapter 1, as we talked about last year whenever we were teaching the course in Genesis. And then when chapter 2 comes along, he does something that happens quite frequently in the Old Testament. He comes back with a chapter that kind of goes back and then fills in a lot of information that we did not have before. So that's just a type of thing that takes place in the Old Testament. But you have actually in verse 27 the statement male and female, and God blessed them. He's speaking now again in the plural. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Well, it would take both of them. One of the problems with same-sex marriage is same-sex marriage will never produce a child. It'll never produce a child. You've got to go outside the marriage to produce a child. Or you have to have adoption, but it's still not produced. They are to fill the earth, be fruitful and multiply. It's interesting that passage, multiply and fill the earth, is used several times. You'll find it even into Noah. Subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds in the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And of course, he gives them plant. He saw that what was made, and it was good. The marriage that was made was good. The creation was good. But he begins to define this, and he says it's not good for the man that man should be alone. And that's true. It's true. It's not good for either a man or a woman to be alone. There is a need, and we'll talk about those needs, I think, on Saturday. And one of those needs is just affection. Every man and every woman needs affection, needs that comfort of a hug, of holding hands, and many of those kinds of things, of partnership, of communication. All of these things are important in marriage. It's not good for man to be alone. You know, that's the first thing the Bible says is not good. Everything else up to this point was good, but now he says it's not good. He says, so I will make a helper fit for him. So out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and he brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. And the man gave names to all livestock, and to the birds of the heavens, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs, closed up its place with the flesh, and the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Now, woman, the word for woman, is very similar to the word for man. They were made a part of each other. And I think that's something that's important. The man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." I think that's an amazing statement. And therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's a statement, of course, that Jesus refers to. And that's what marriage really is. That the relation between a man and his wife. Now, it's funny that this particular statement made by Moses, not by Adam, but by Moses, in this beginning time, was before there were any children. And Adam and Eve didn't have a mama and a daddy. And so that particular phrase had to have been written in later on. I do believe that Moses wrote the book of Genesis. He did it by inspiration of God. In chapter 3, we see about the woman and how the woman had a conversation with the serpent. God had told them they could not eat of any tree in the garden that was in the midst of the garden. I mean, they could eat of any tree except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, let me mention that it is the knowledge of good and evil, not the tree of the knowledge of evil and evil, but the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. And they were not to eat of it. Well, he's asking the question, and she says, "We may eat of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it." She adds that. And I'm sure Adam had probably said something to her. I don't think she did that all on her own. I think Adam said, "No, let's don't even get near it, not even touch it. Let's not be tempted by it. Lest you die." Serpent said to the woman, "You shall not surely die." He lied. "Well, God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be open." Well, that may be true, but oh, the consequences of it. "And you will be like God." That's not true. Knowing good and evil. Well, she would know good and evil. That's true. But she would not be like God. So when the woman saw the tree was good for food, it was pleasant for the eyes, the tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Now, she was beguiled, he was not, but in my judgment, he committed the worst sin because he knew what he was doing, and he still did it. He still did it, and it was wrong. So God says to the woman, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Genesis 4:1-2. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, "I have gotten a man from the Lord." And then she bore again, and this time brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it was in this relationship that you have children born, of course, with a male and a female. It took both. There are some cultures of the world that thought while women was kind of like an incubation, the man was the one who created the person, he begot, and that was it. But of course, at this point in time, we know that it takes both a man and a woman for a child to be made. A man and another man can't produce a child. A woman and another woman cannot produce a child. There has to be the seed of the man and the egg of the woman, or it will not be produced. And the Lord God said, "It's not good that man should be alone. I'm going to make a helper comparable to him." And that's why women are a little bit different than men. And I'm glad it's that way. I'm glad that women and men are a little different. They're different structurally. They're different emotionally. And those things are good. She has abilities to, as you mentioned, to nurture children. I found out that when my kids were little, they needed their mama. But every year they got older and wanted this and that, they wanted then their daddy. But it was that way with my girls. The older they got, the more close they got to me. But there are many men who have the ability to nurture, and there are many women who are able to do things. But for the most part, men and women are different. And it is not wrong to say men and women are different. And when the culture says don't say that, they're nuts. They're nuts. They're nuts. Men and women are different. They're not alike. Yes, there are some women that are a little more masculine in some traits, and there are some men that are a little more feminine in some traits. But men are men and women are women, and they are not the same. They are not the same, and I'm thankful. That's the way God made us, and it should be that way. Proverbs 18:22. When Hugo McCord proposed to his wife, they were sitting in chapel. Hugo McCord was one of my teachers. They were sitting in chapel, and he slipped a note to her in chapel with Proverbs 18:22 on it. That when a man finds a wife, he finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. And that's how he proposed to his wife. At that time, they did not allow men and women to go out on a date together. The only place they could go on a date was on Sunday nights to church. They could not hold hands. He would hold one end of the stick and she would hold the other end of the stick. And they would go to church. And that's how they walked together, holding a stick between them. And that was the rules in those days. Brother McCord went to his dean and he said to him, he said, some of us preachers have to preach away from here. And we preach on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights. And if we can only have a date at church with our girls, then we won't ever have a chance to have a date with our girls. Don't you think that's a little unfair? And the administrator looked up at him and said, well, and I love the way Hugo McCord would say it. He said, preacher boys have to make sacrifices. That was a no. But so he passed her a note in chapel. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them and God gave them that commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. That was God's command. And subdue it. And have dominion, of course. And I mentioned 1 Corinthians 7:2, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Now, God's plan for marriage is to provide companionship, to prevent sexual immorality, and to provide children with loving parents. Now, whenever a person is single, it's very obvious that they can be passionate and burn in lust. And he mentions that in 1 Corinthians 7. And Paul makes the statement, it's better to marry than it is to burn in lust. But see, this idea of desire is in all of us, the hormones that we have and the way that God made us. God made us to procreate. And so there are people who live lives of a eunuch, some for no fault or no desire of their own. Some decide that that's the direction they want to go, some physically. But most people have the desire to procreate, and sex is a part of life. And so this is the reason why he makes the point that the way that this desire is to be satisfied is in marriage. And marriage can provide a home where Christianity is practiced. In the Christian home, God is considered in every decision. The husband and wife and children are encouraged to live as Jesus wants them to live. The Christian home serves as an example to non-Christians who want the same kind of happiness that they see in the home of other Christians. And if you want a better home, then learn to live as Jesus means for us to live. That's just the long and short of it. According to a 1999 Rutgers University study, only 25% of all marriages that began 10 years ago are enduring and happy. Only 10%. In other words, 3 out of 4 couples who married a decade ago are either divorced or unhappily married. Only 1 in 4 are both still married and happily so. Let me just say that it doesn't have to be that way. Marriage is what you make it. Marriage is a covenant before God and witnesses that 2 people will love each other and unite their lives until death separates them. And keeping an oath that is made before God and witnesses matters. Well, it's just a piece of paper. No, it's not. It's also the oath that goes with that piece of paper. It's that promise that is there. Malachi 2, some pronounce it Malachi, perhaps more correctly so. Chapter 2, verses 13 to 16. This is another thing you do, God is saying. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. And yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, although she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Now that's where we learn that marriage is a covenant. But not one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? He says, take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth. For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with wrong, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit, that you do not deal treacherously. Now, it's interesting that he mentions the spirit, the heart. It's in Matthew 12, you recall that Jesus talks about the heart and how that fornications and adulteries start in the heart. That's where they start from. The first marriage that united Adam and Eve was performed by God. Whatever God has joined together. And I believe that marriage today is an act of God as well. When a brother or sister in Christ decide they want to marry each other, that God is the one who joins them together. And this is why marriage really is a sacred thing. It really is sacred. And no marriage should be entered into frivolously or as the marriage, since it demands the most out of both the bride and the groom. I don't believe that there is any commitment that a man makes that is more serious than being married. The situation with the children is pretty tough. The situation of being the child of an aged parent is pretty tough. But marriage is the thing that lasts for a lifetime. When I was a child at home until I went to college, I had children in my home until they got old enough to go to college. But I've been with Jackie for nearly 50 years, longer than any other relationship I've ever had. And that's the way it is with marriage. It's for a lifetime between 2 people. Now, I mentioned that a covenant is not a contract, which may be easily broken. But it is actually a lifelong, legal, binding relationship. Covenants are legal. And it is a binding relationship. Whenever I do a wedding, this is the vows that I often have them do. I so-and-so, take you so-and-so. Well, I guess it's more than that. It could be, I, Phil, take you, Jackie, to be my lawful and wedded companion, to live together according to the teachings of God, to love, honor, cherish, and I say and protect, and she says respect, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, and to give myself to you and to you alone until death do us part. Well, that's a pretty strong commitment. Somebody said you could have as many 16 wives, 4 better and 4 worse. Never mind. That's wrong. But you know what? I married her when she was good, and I married her when she was not so good. I'm married to her when she's sick, and I'm married to her when she's healthy. I'm married to her when things are better, and I'm married to her when things are worse. And when things are richer and when things are poorer. I'm still married. I'm still married. And that covenant relationship and commitment that two people make to each other is the foundation of a family. The foundation of that family. When a husband and wife love each other and care for each other and are willing to be committed to each other. That doesn't mean they always speak as kindly to each other as they should. But the fact is that the love is still there and the commitment is still there. I suspect there's been a few times when Jackie could have walked me upside the face, whatever, and those kind of things. I'm sure that I irritate her and she sometimes irritates me. Yes, she does. But I still love her and she still loves me, and that's important. And you see, that's the kind of foundation for our children. It's not just the man and his wife that they can have security in one another, but it's the security that children have, that mom and dad love each other. I can't help what went on before me. I can only determine for myself how I'm going to live. A lot of people have grown up in homes where there has been a broken home. My father was married twice. My mother was only married once. But you have a situation where you don't always have everything the way you want them to be. But when you do make that commitment in the eyes of God, I can't go back and make decisions that my parents made. I can only make the decision for my life to do what I can do for my children's sake and for other people's sake. And this is one of those areas where we've got to let our lights shine. Doesn't matter what all went on in other places and other times. We can't help and we can't change decisions that other people make. But we can make a decision for our lives as to what is best and what we want our children to be and how we want them to live. And that's an important part of it. Sometimes people marry wisely and sometimes they marry foolishly. And it can create a lot of unhappiness. But when you marry, you marry. When you make the decision, you stay with it, even as difficult as it is. And while the Bible never gives an example of a wedding ceremony as far as what's said in the ceremony, it does acknowledge frequently that the practice existed throughout history of making a covenant and making oaths and pledges to one another. The wedding itself is not as important as the marriage. I don't know how many times I've done weddings and people spend tens of thousands of dollars on flowers and all kinds of things that won't even be looked at 2 weeks later, when it would have been so much smarter for them to have thought about what kind of people are we going to be after the marriage is over, after the wedding is gone. I remember a young man coming to my office one time and he was crying. He and his wife had a storybook wedding with a horse-drawn carriage at Disney World. With all of the finery, they had won some kind of thing and they got all this. And it was a year after their wedding took place, and he came home one day and found her with another man. Here was a storybook wedding and a rotten marriage. That's not what we need to have. We need to have pure, good marriages. And working towards loving and honoring your spouse is what makes good homes. And the world needs examples of men and women who, when they make a commitment, will stay with it for a lifetime till death do us part is part of it. And that's why I say the wedding itself is not as important as the marriage. The vows are important because they're the basis of the marriage. But all of the other hubbub of who's going to sing and what are you going to wear and all these other things, They're important to the girl. They're not very important to the guy. I'll put it that way. You know, there is bridezillas in the world today that it really make it very important. So I'll hush. But being the father of 4 children, one of the things that I knew about being the daddy of the bride was this: keep your mouth shut till you say her mother and I, and pay for it all. You know, living with the same person for a lifetime requires a lot of love. And that love is different as we age. You know, when you're 22 and 19, there are a lot of hormones and a lot of activities that go on that make life very pleasurable. But when you're 70 and 68, it's not quite the same. The love changes and it's real. It's when you look into their eyes and you see when they hurt. And you try to be close to them, to comfort them, strengthen them. That's what makes a home. And that's what makes long-lasting marriages, and caring about them. I have a brother whose wife has been ill almost all of their married life. And he changes diapers. He changes diapers. That's love. He married her for life. And even after all these years, 50 years of marriage and more, he's still with her. He's still there. That's what marriage is. It is loving when you're young and still loving when you're old. Loving when you can be loved back and loving when you can't be loved back in the way that you would like. But you love anyway and you care anyway. Loving for a lifetime requires a lot of flexibility. And sometimes people talk about, oh, we have a marriage that's 50-50. No, it's not 50-50 if it's going to last. It needs to be 100-100. Sometimes you have to give all the way. And they have to give all the way. When you commit to somebody, you commit to them completely. And you're going to stay with them. And that means flexibility. It means that I don't always get my way. And she doesn't always get her way. That we learn to listen to each other. And we'll talk more about those things probably tomorrow night. Here's 10 important research findings on marriage and choosing a marriage partner. This comes from the National Marriage Projects. By the way, if you look this up online, you will find an extensive number of footnotes to show studies about all these things. These were not just little facts that they dreamed up, somebody's opinion. Number 1, marrying as a teenager is the highest known risk factor for divorce. People who marry in their teens are 2 to 3 times more likely to divorce than people who marry in their 20s or older. Number 2, the most likely way to find a future marriage partner is through an introduction by family, friends, or acquaintances. And despite the romantic notion that people meet and fall in love through a chance or fate, the evidence suggests that social networks are important. Number 3, the more similar people are in their values, backgrounds, and life goals, the more likely they are to have a successful marriage. Let me say this, that Jackie grew up in a family with 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. I grew up in a family with 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Now, when you grow up in a family with 6 kids, nobody has very much. And you know what? There were a whole lot about her life and our life that was very similar. And I think that was very helpful. And when people have a lot of similarities in their backgrounds and families and things, it makes a difference. Opposites may attract, but they may not live together harmoniously as married couples after a long period unless they can learn to have a lot of shared interests and a lot of shared things. People who share common backgrounds and similar social networks are better suited as marriage partners than people who are very different in their backgrounds and networks. That's not always true. There are a lot of people who have married people from other lands and people who are very different than themselves, and they've made it home. But it's sometimes harder when you have people who are very different than yourself in lots of ways. Women have a significantly better chance of marrying if they do not become single parents before marrying. Now that makes sense. Having a child out of wedlock reduces the chances of ever marrying. Number 5, both women and men who are college educated are more likely to marry and less likely to divorce than people with lower levels of education. And there it talks about situations, about various things that relate to that. Despite occasional news stories predicting lifelong singlehood for college-educated women, these predictions have proven false. Though the first generation of college-educated women, those who earned baccalaureate degrees in the 20s, married less frequently than their less well-educated peers, the reverse is true today. College-educated women's chances of marrying are better than less than well-educated women. However, the growing gender gap in college education may make it more difficult for college women to find similarly well-educated men in the future. Let me say that there are about twice as many women going to college as there are men this day and time, and certainly twice as many college-educated women. It's very much changed. Men seek other ways to make their money than college, and many women. If a guy wants to find a wife, go to a Christian college because there's more girls there than there are boys. I'll guarantee you. That's true. If a guy wants to find a wife, it's a Christian. Living together before marriage has not proved useful as a trial marriage. And really that's what I was talking about when I talked about is marriage obsolete, talking about cohabiting. People who have multiple cohabiting relationships before marriage are more likely to experience marital conflict, marital unhappiness, and eventual divorce than people who do not cohabit before marriage. Now, these are trends. These are not, fixed in stone, but this is what's more likely. Researchers attribute some, but not all, of these differences to the differing characteristics of people who cohabit, the so-called selection effect, rather than the experience of cohabiting itself. It's been hypothesized that the negative effects of cohabitation on future marital success may diminish as living together becomes a common experience among today's young adults. However, according to one recent study of couples who were married between 1981 and 1997, the negative effects persist among many younger cohorts, supporting the view that the cohabitation experience itself contributes to problems in marriage. It does. It does. And sometimes people cohabit for a while and then they get married and they feel like they've been forced to marry. And that creates a kind of a bit of a grudge at times later on. Marriage does help people to generate income and wealth. Married people generally have a better financial basis than single people and cohabiting people. So marriage is a good thing. It's not always necessary just that both have wages, both have a job. Sometimes it's just the fact that they do better because of a number of different things. People who are married are more likely to have emotionally and physically satisfying sex lives than single people or those who just live together. Does that surprise you? It shouldn't. When two people really love each other, they are far more satisfied with each other and many times know how to please each other in ways that people who are single do not know. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of things have been surprising, that there have been more than a few studies, and sometimes of hundreds of thousands, and they have found that married people just have a better life like that than people who are single. Contrary to popular belief that marriage sex is boring and infrequent, married people report higher levels of sexual satisfaction in both sexually active singles and cohabiting couples, according to the most comprehensive and recent surveys of sexuality. 42% of wives said that they found sex extremely emotionally and physically satisfying, compared to just 31% of single women who had a sex partner. And 48% of husbands said sex was extremely satisfying emotionally, compared to just 37% of cohabitating men. The higher level of commitment in marriage is probably the reason for the high level of reported sexual satisfaction. Marital commitment contributes to a greater sense of trust and security, less drug and alcohol-infused sex, and more mutual communication between the couple, which is very, very important. People who grow up in a family broken by divorce are slightly less likely to marry and much more likely to divorce when they do marry, but that's not always true. Number 10, for large segments of the population, the risk of divorce is far below 50%. Although the overall divorce rate in America remains close to 50% of all marriages, it has been dropping gradually over the past 2 decades. Also, the risk of divorce is far below 50% for educated people going into their first marriage, and lower still for people who wait to marry, at least until their mid-20s, and haven't lived with many different partners prior to marriage, or are strongly religious and marry someone of the same faith. So those are some things that really make a difference, and these are the reasons why you tell your children to marry a Christian. These are the reasons why, and those things are important. Okay, I don't want to start this section on love. Well, we go ahead and start. We'll at least get it started, and then we'll come back and look at it more in detail because we got started late. When I developed some of these lessons, they were developed for about 30 minutes instead of for 45. Ephesians 5:33, I think, is probably one of the most important passages when it comes to marriage in the entire New Testament. He says, however, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Ephesians 5:33. When we went to Minsk, Belarus in 1992, and then later on into Odessa in 96 and 97, one of the things that we found in those countries, Belarus and Ukraine, were that so many of the young adults were not married. And many of the men were not taught how to love their wives. In those countries, men would beat their wives or spank their wives or whatever, just like they would spank a child. And that was certainly not very loving and certainly not a good way to have a relationship. Now, because of his harshness towards his wife at times, and he was the boss, he was the head, and he was the this and that, she did not have respect. And many of the women who were in their 20s, having seen the way their fathers treated their mothers, had no desire to get married. No desire at all. Because she did not respect men. And she didn't want to be treated like that. It was so interesting when Christian men would come into those areas, men who had been married and loved their wives and treated their wives with kindness. It was so interesting to see how these young ladies would look at American men differently than they did the Russian men, the ones in that part of the world. And of course, let's remember that communism, socialism, and godlessness was a part of their culture. And that's what led to these kinds of things. And because they looked at life so differently, the respect was absent and the love was absent. And so you had an awful lot of homes. We think we have bad homes here. Homes that have been characterized with socialism are horrible messes. Horrible messes. That doesn't mean that there are not some good homes, but the percentage of homes that men beat their wives and the wives don't respect men and so they never marry, and all of the problems that people have, the lack of love, the lack of support is very, very great in that part of the world. The amount of cohabiting before marriage, all of the things that we've talked about, is just so difficult, so very difficult. We really have lived in a very good culture, to have lived in a culture where men have been taught to love their wives, to treat their wives with kindness, to respect their wives, and where wives have been taught to respect their husbands. A lot of young men have been taught how to be good daddies in more recent years, and I'm thankful for that. I've seen a lot of young men that I thought were really good fathers, maybe a better father than I was to my children, but they had some teaching that I didn't have, and that's an awful lot of it. But love and respect. You know, it's interesting that what is mostly said to men is to love their wives. And mostly what is said to women is that they respect their husbands. I think the only time that we have a woman told to love her husband is in that Titus 2 passage where the older women are to teach the younger women to love their husbands and to love their children. Let's remember that marriage was often to a stranger in that part of the world. Often in that part of the world, a woman, her father, or some of the other men in her family. Among Jews, usually it was not the father who negotiated for the girl, negotiated with the groom's family. You know, the families did the negotiating, deciding who was going to marry who. It would never be the father of the bride. It would always be an uncle or an older brother or someone like that who did the negotiating. I always thought that was funny, the way that they did that, but they would negotiate with the father of the groom. And there would be promises and money would be involved. And one of the reasons why there would be a dowry was, well, what happens if this guy dies? She's going to, you know, we have to find some way to provide for her. And a few things like that. And many of the things that took place in marriage laws in the Old Testament, and they're brought even into the New Testament, have to do with security for a woman. And also teaching a man to love his wife and a wife to love her husband, but also for him to treat her with kindness and for her to respect him. All of these things are so important in the marriage. And this is the will of God. And these verses that we're going to look at in a little bit in more detail, I think are so valuable, so important. And in those societies where these things have not been taught, you have lots and lots of problems. Alcoholism, you have all kinds of crime, you have all kinds of division in families, all kinds of problems with violence and other things. And this is why doing things God's way and making sure that we are going to do what's right is so vital and so important. Okay, let's stop here and take a break for just a little bit. And then I want us to go ahead and to start on page 16 and go for a while, maybe a good little while, maybe get all the way from about 16 and try to get as far as we can through the rest of the. As Christian husbands and wives, we should do what is right, even when doing what is right isn't easy. Jesus set the example in 1 Peter 2:21-23. For to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. Now, I do not have this in this passage here or in this place here, but I would say right out in your margin, 1 Peter 4 and verse 19, which is what is said to Christians about their lives. 1 Peter 4 and verse 19. Now, what was said here is that Jesus continued entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. But in 1 Peter 4 and verse 19, it says, therefore let those also who suffer according to the will of God entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Now that's what's said to you and me. First we have the example of Jesus, and then we have the command of how we are to do. You do what is right, no matter how hard it is. And that means that sometimes it's let me tell you what, it's not easy to love somebody sometimes that you marry, or your kids. It's not easy to love your kids sometimes. But you do what is right even when it's tough. And Jesus loved us even when we were unlovely. You know, some people are very lovable. And some people, it requires a lot of work to love them. Jesus loved us when we were unlovely and sinful, and He died for us even when we were helpless and ungodly. And we have to do what is right even when others do not do what is right. And I will make that point more applicable in a little bit. All right, here's what's said to the men. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her, that He might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that He might present the church to Himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Well, it says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Verse 22. Husbands should love their wives as their own bodies, and he who loves his wife loves himself. Now, let me tell you something, guys. The best thing you can do for your own happiness is to love your wife. You love her, and you'll be much happier than if you don't. The best thing you can do is to love your wife as you love yourself. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nurses and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Isn't that interesting? Let each one of you love his wife as himself. Verse 33. Let the wife see that she respects her husband. Colossians 3:19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Colossians 3:18. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. 1 Peter 3:7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. You mistreat your wife, and God's not going to listen to your prayers. Now, that's just straightforward, isn't it? Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. When I was a kid, those kinds of things were taught an awful lot more than I hear them taught today, but then I don't sit in ladies' classes very much today. But I used to hear that from the pulpit more often. They, that is older women, are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. See, part of the reason for their submission is so that the word of God would not be reviled. Isn't that interesting? There are two terms that are used talking about this role of submission and respect. The word for to be subject is the word hupotasso. To be subject, to be subordinate, to passive, to be subject when it's used in the passive, to be subject and submit to obey, to be under the authority of, to take a subordinate place. My wife is very straightforward in how she talks to me, but she has always been somebody that has taken a place of subordination to me as well. Yeah, she's going to speak to me and tell me what she needs. Now, let me tell you something, wives. If you don't tell your husbands how to love you, they won't know how to love you. They're dumber than a doornail. Really, if wives don't tell their husbands how they want to be loved, they won't know. Now, a woman always knows how to love her husband, but a husband doesn't always know how to love his wife. And communication is so very important. But especially women need to communicate. And men, you think she's nagging you, but you better listen. You really should. Because she's teaching you how to love. Love is not something that is inborn. Love is something that has to be learned. You have to learn how to love people. You have to learn how to love God. You know, God tells us how He wants us to love Him, and that is keep my commandments. And we have to learn how to love each other. Love listens. If I had one course that one day I want to, and I will talk about this, I think, tomorrow night. But if I had one course that I would want to teach men, it would be how to listen. When I took courses in psychology and counseling and such, they would teach us how to listen. And when I want to be, I can be a real good listener. When I want to be. And sometimes I think we have to really work hard to listen. Men have more trouble learning to listen than women do. Have you ever heard a man and a woman talk about the same event? The same event. He will talk about that event and he will summarize in 3 sentences everything that happened over a period of an hour. And she will remember everything that everybody said and give a detailed report on what happened in that same period of time. I am amazed at how women can remember what was said in a discussion by every person in that discussion. And part of it is just the way that men and women are wired. Men are not wired the same way as women. Let me go one little step farther and talk about men. Let me tell you something. Whenever I was in graduate school and whenever I was taking Greek, it took every bit of my focus to learn Greek. It took every bit of my focus when I was in graduate school to learn the things that I had to learn and to read the things I had to read. And I had to shut the whole world out. Men have lives in cubby holes where they look at this cubby hole and they can move the whole world away while they focus on this one fact and really concentrate on it. And there are many things that men do where they have to have that level of concentration. The unfortunate thing is when they're concentrating on something so heavily that they become a bit of a nerd and they shut everybody else out. I can work in my desk and in my office, and the whole world in my office can go on and do what they want to do, and I'm still working. I've learned to focus. But when somebody comes in my office and wants to speak to me, I have to quit focusing on my work, and I have to focus on the person. And there are times when men have focused all day long and worked all day long, focusing on this and focusing on that. They come home and they want a little bit of peace and they want a little bit of quiet for a time. And she hasn't focused on anybody all day, and now he's home and she wants to focus on him, and she wants him to focus on her. And that's where sometimes men have to come out of that, and they have to learn when they come home to take one hat off and put another hat on. A lot of life is learning how to be flexible enough to make the changes in life from one thing to the other and let time and effort work. I have a hearing problem. Some of it is mental from what we've talked about, and some of it is I don't hear as well as I used to hear. And if I weren't so arrogant, I would wear my hearing aids. I did put them on here about 2 weeks ago, and the left one doesn't work, so I took them out again. One of these days, I'll figure out why the left one doesn't work or get some new ones. But my whole point is that men have to work at listening far more than women do. Women are very perceptive, and a good husband will always listen to his wife's perspectives because she sees things that he doesn't know how to see. She notices things that he will not notice. And any man who's been a preacher or been an elder realizes that his wife has some antennas to catch things that he can't catch himself. And she is a great value and a great help to him in that regard. Now, the word hupotasso means to be in subjection. This is the word that's used of Jesus being subject to the Father. But the word obey also is used in Philippians 2 and verse 5. But Jesus is in subjection to the Father. Now, for a wife to be in subjection to her husband is no different than Jesus being in subjection to the Father, is it? Is it? You know, one of the things I find is all of us are in subjection to something. Nobody's really boss. No matter how big you think you are, you still have a bunch of bosses. Now, once in a while, I tell people, you know, I'm in a job now where I'm kind of my own boss. That's not true. I have a whole lot of coworkers, and when they come into my office and say, "Oh, Phil, we need this right now," let me tell you what, I have to perform right now. I can't wait, because their job depends on me listening to them and being subject to their needs for that particular time. There are other times whenever things take place, and you know what, in a role like I'm at, you don't think that the thousands of churches and elderships that support my work, that they don't let me know how they think from time to time, that I don't have an obligation to God and to them? Oh yes, oh yes. Nobody is in a role where they are not subject to other people. The other one is to respect, and that is the word phobeomai. That's how you pronounce that second word. The hupotasso is the one above. The H comes from that little squirrely thing above the U, what looks like a U. And that P is the next letter, and all of those others. And those are S's. It may look like a zero with something on there, but those are S's. And then one below that is a phi. And some people call it phi, but it's actually a phi, phobeomai. And it means to fear, to be afraid of. That is to respect, sometimes in a very positive way. Now, all marriages go through rough spots and challenges. I know Jackie and I have had our share of parenting responsibilities. We've had more than a few financial challenges raising 4 children. Let me tell you what, in 1977 we had 1 child, in 1981 we had 4. And they were little. And they required a lot of work, and it was expensive to have 4 children. The only break we got was the IRS. We've had our challenges with health problems. I'm certainly not the perfect husband. Jackie's had to put up with my weaknesses, and I've had to live with some of her illnesses. Jackie suffers from a severe case of rheumatoid arthritis. She has many other health problems, and it's a difficult thing. And you know what? If I married her, I still love her, and I still have to take care of her in sickness and in health, no matter what. And we've never forgotten the commitment that we made to each other in the presence of God and witnesses. Both of us vowed to love and respect each other. And when we turn to Scripture, love and respect are really the key to happiness in Scripture. It's interesting that the dominant thing for the woman is respect, the dominant thing for the man is love. Whenever he loves, it makes things so much better. When she respects, it makes things so much better. But both of them have to do that, even if the other one is not doing what they're supposed to do. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things. Bauer, in his latest lexicon, when he talks about the word bear, talks about the idea of protect as part of the meaning of that word. Love protects. And I remember the first time I heard that, I was kind of shocked by that. And then I looked it up and I said, yep, there it is. There it is. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. In chapter 14, verse 1, there is just the simple statement in the very first part of it, pursue love. I don't know why they left that out. They should have joined that to chapter 13. Pursue love. Husbands and wives need to pursue love. And the way you pursue love is to give love. Now, the next couple of paragraphs are very important. These came from Emerson Eggerichs in his book, Love and Respect. When a husband feels disrespected, he has a natural tendency to react in a way in ways that feel unloving to his wife. Perhaps the command to love was given to him precisely for this reason. When a wife feels unloved, she has a natural tendency to react in ways that feel disrespectful to her husband. And perhaps the command to respect was given to her precisely for this reason. A husband is even called to love a disrespectful wife. And a wife is called to respect an unloving husband. There's no justification for a husband to say, I will love my wife after she respects me, nor for a wife to say, I will respect my husband after he loves me. The husband has to do what is right, even if the wife is not doing it. And the wife has to do what is right, even if the husband is not doing it. Now, the scriptures teach the husband is the head of the wife and that she's to be subject to him. And in our day, when equality seems to be so important, some think it's unfair that God gave authority to husbands over their wives. This authority, however, never gives men the right to abuse or to dominate their wives. Any man who treats the woman he married unkindly is breaking God's law. He's not only disobeying God, he's also deceiving himself. Only a fool believes abusing his wife will benefit him. Wise husbands understand the better they treat their wives, the more their wives will respond with love and respect. When I was in Florida yesterday, I was sitting and having a conversation with a fellow named Kevin. You'll know who I'm talking about. And while we were having this conversation, as they were putting the tables and chairs up and all of that, Daniel, his wife was rubbing his shoulders and giving him all kinds of affection. And he said, well, I don't want to make you jealous. And I thought, yeah, here I am, been away from my wife for 3 or 4 days, and there she's giving you kisses on your bald head and rubbing your shoulders and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm not supposed to be jealous. I thought it was wonderful that she cared that much for him and that he cared that much for her. And they were not newlyweds. You guys have to keep the fires burning, male and female. You have to keep the fires burning. You have to work with love. And I think it's so important for husbands and wives to care for each other and to love each other. The second paragraph says, when husbands fail to love their wives will act with that disrespect. When husbands sense a lack of respect in their wives, they often act in ways that are unloving. So these feelings of being disrespected or unloved tear apart the marriage. But when husbands show love and wives show respect, the marriage prospers and strengthens. Now, you can make your marriage brighter and better, husbands, if you learn to demonstrate Christian love to your wife. If a disrespected husband will love his wife anyway, and if a wife who feels unloved will respect her husband anyway, they can start putting their damaged marriage back together. Yeah. A wise husband pays attention to his wife. He cares. And you can make your marriage brighter and better if you learn to demonstrate Christian love. That's so important. Every woman needs to feel her husband is close to her and cares about her. Some husbands keep their distance from their wives, and their wives feel unloved because of it. Wives need husbands who will open up enough to share their thoughts and feelings. That's sometimes hard for a man, but he needs to open up and share himself with her. She feels unwanted or unneeded when he closes up and shuts her out of his life. And when he keeps his life secret from her, she feels he doesn't love her enough to trust her. Wives need to know their husbands are loyal to the marriage, that he's not looking elsewhere. She also needs to know that he sees her as the most important person in his life, except for God. She needs to know that he cherishes and honors her. The most important thing a husband can do is to love his wife, and we talked about that. Love may start with a warm feeling, but we must learn how to love. I think that is so important. And you learn how to love by listening, watching, seeing what's going on. My wife's hands don't work very well because of her arthritis. So I bought her one of these can openers that you put on top of the can and you push the button and it goes around and opens the can just with a push of a button. And she didn't have to do this anymore. I'm not the greatest husband in the world, but I was looking for ways to help her not have so much pain unnecessarily. That's what it means to love your wife. That's what it means to love somebody who care for them, to provide for their needs. And you have to know what their needs are to provide for those. Like I say, some folks are harder to love than others. Some people don't know how to give love, and they have to be taught sometimes how to do that. Love requires a lot of patience and kindness. Love demands that we set ourselves aside and make other people more important than we are. I can't love somebody else if I'm focused on myself and self-centered. Love rules out envy, arrogance, and rudeness. It learns to let small things slide and not be irritated all the time. Love bears what marriage demands, believes and hopes the best in our spouse, and endures. Love determines to put the best interests of our spouses before our own. That's what really love is all about. That's part of the definition, regardless of the cost. Jesus loved the church like that, and he asked husbands to love their wives that way. Loving your wife involves taking the time to be close to her and to listen. The happiest couples spend time with each other, talking and listening to each other. Husbands and wives should spend a good while each day in meaningful conversation and turn that TV off and talk to each other and do things together. Get away from the computer and talk face to face. A wise husband will take the time to share his life with the woman that he loves. He shares his life with her. He wants to know about her, and he's willing to invest his life in her by listening. Listening is a great gift. To listen to somebody. To fail to pay attention to your wife is to say to her that you do not care what she has to say. And that kind of behavior is abusive, not loving. Know this, my beloved brothers, James 1:19-20. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness that God requires. Much of the anger in our homes would go away if people would take the time to listen and to understand the people they love and to ask questions when you don't understand. Listen to your spouse. Let her finish her sentences. I think sometimes that's an area that I need to work on. Don't act rashly or hastily. Boy, when people act before they think, they usually make a mistake. Try to understand her life from her point of view. James Dobson, back in the 70s, wrote a book, and I don't even know whether it's still in print anymore. It says, What Wives Wish Their Husbands Knew About Women. And Daniel, that's a book that I would give to young couples when I would counsel to them or tell them about that book. And I think it's probably still can be bought. But What Wives Wish Their Husbands Knew About Women. That book is quite dated. It's nearly 50 years old. It was around shortly after I married, back in the 70s. But it was a situation book that was so helpful in helping young men learn about their wives and some of the things they go through. And it's a good book. And there are other books that are written to women to help them understand what men are like. Because men and women are different. And it's that differences that cause a lot of the problems. And they have to learn about each other. Husbands should treat your wives kindly, and we've talked about that. Some men have the awful attitude that because the husband is the head of the wife, that this position of authority, this is page 19, gives them the right to dominate or abuse their wives with their power. Any man who treats his wife like a doormat is violating the will of God. Abusive power is a marriage killer. Husbands, treat your wife kindly. Tell your wife how important and valuable. Show her that she is the queen of your life and precious to you. And watch for that loving smile on her face when you do it, because it'll be there. Proverbs says, an excellent wife who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. Proverbs 31, 10 and 11. Notice how the wise husband trusts his wife's judgments and realizes how fortunate he is to have her. Yeah. It's utter foolishness for a man to expect his wife to love him and meet all his needs while he treats her unkindly. Husbands, love your wives. Now, Jesus taught, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way that you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. And I'm amazed at how kind and good people can be. They can do such good things to those who are outside the family and treat their own families with disrespect. If we could see ourselves as we really are and how we treat our families, we might be quite shocked. If we had a tape recording of our words or a video of our actions, we might see ourselves the way our families see us. Some folks never consider how difficult they make their families' lives. That's why every now and then it's good for all of us to step back and take a long look at how we have treated our families. Empathy is the ability to see things through the eyes of somebody else and to feel what that person, he or she, is feeling. Sometimes we look at ourselves through others' eyes, and when we do that, we have to ask ourselves, well, what am I going to see? And do we like what we see? Sometimes I don't like myself when I look in the mirror. David said, this is in Psalm 139. Psalm 139, the last two verses, verse 23 and 24. This is a passage that I think is so valuable in looking at these kinds of things. Verse 23 of Psalm 139, David had spent the whole psalm, this marvelous psalm, talking about God's presence in his life. How God is present in everything in his life. And as he ends the psalm, he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. And see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. Now here was David in his relationship with the Father in heaven. Now, he says, search me, O God. God already had searched David. God already knew everything about David. God didn't need to search him. He already knew. He knows everything. God always knows. But David needed to know what God knew. David needed to know what God knew. And so he says, search me, O God, and try my heart. Know my heart and try me and know my anxious thoughts, the things that aren't what they ought to be. And if there is any hurtful, King James uses the word grievous way in me, then lead me in the everlasting way. And I think there are times when husbands and wives need to do that. And when we were doing the His Needs, Her Needs program, Jackie and I, years ago, we did that with a congregation 2 or 3 times, and we went through it ourselves. One of the things that we would do is whenever each person would talk about their lives and what was the subject of the week, they would be told, all right, now when you get up and you talk, you do not say anything negative about your spouse. If there's something that needs to be corrected, you talk about yourself, what you have done and what you have learned. Don't talk about what he or she has learned and she or he has done. You let them say that for themselves. You say what you need to know about you. And what that purpose of that exercise was is for each person to examine himself. For each person to think about, what can I do to make my marriage better? And that was an important thing, to make marriage better. But that's my responsibility. It's not, I'm going to wait until my wife, my husband changes and then I'll make it better. No, you make it better, and you be the one to take the initiative. But you know what? When both the husband and wife both are told to take the initiative and both of them do, wow. But you take the initiative. If you want things to be better, a better world begins with me. You know, that's still true. You do your best. And I think that's important. A wise husband will be the spiritual leader in his home. It's spiritually important for couples to spend time together singing, praying, reading the Bible. There's great value in a husband and wife privately praying together every day. Prayer allows husbands and wives to take their burdens together to God, the Father. And it allows them to express in each other's presence and in the presence of God their concerns and needs. I have no problem with husbands and wives privately praying with each other. Sometimes he's speaking, sometimes she's speaking. If Aquila and Priscilla could teach Apollos, they can pray together too. There's no sin in that. And sometimes prayer helps us to understand one another much better. That doesn't mean that I think women ought to lead and worship the church. I'm talking about what happens in the home. And there's a difference. There's a big difference. When two people pray with each other, they develop a spiritual intimacy and unity that builds their relationship. Christian marriages where God is the center of the home, where love and where patience and forgiveness are present, and where God's laws are obeyed, almost never end in divorce. God's ways are not only right ways, they are the best ways. When people truly live out their faith the way God intended, they find their marriages to be the happiest and most loving. Husbands, do your best to make your wife and your home, for a home for your wife, what God would have it to be. Be the spiritual leader in your home, and God's way is truly a way of blessing. And all of these things are very, very important. Let's look down a little farther. There's a section about God. God says, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2, because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, each woman is to have her own husband. Making your home as God teaches is critical to a happy life. Proverbs 12:4, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who shames him is as rottenness in his bones. Let me say that one of the love busters is you don't ever embarrass your spouse in front of other people. You don't ever put them down in front of other people. You don't ever say disrespectful things about them in front of other people. I've preached for a long time, and when I would tell a story about my family, it would never be one where they would look down on one of my kinfolk. I never wanted to tell any story that looked down on somebody that I loved. I didn't mind telling about my own faults, but I did not want to publicly make the faults of my family, talk about the faults of my family in front of others. There are times I would use them in the illustrations, but never in a way that would shame them or anything of that nature. Proverbs 18:22, Solomon says, he who finds a wife finds what's good and receives favor from the Lord. But verse 13 says, a quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping. Last night and the night before and the night before and the night before, I was in the hotel and my door to my room was 10 feet from the ice machine. And I heard ice being made and the dripping, and it was not good. It was irritating at best and sleep depriving at worst. constant dripping. You know, it's irritating. And just like a dripping faucet, a quarrelsome wife is a constant irritation. Proverbs 19, the houses and wealth are inherited from parents, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. Best thing ever happened to me was to become a Christian. The second best thing was to marry Jackie Lynn Dodson. She has been a blessing to me all of these years. I would be lost if it were not for her. Proverbs 31:10, a wife of noble character who can find, she's worth far more than rubies. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Proverbs 31:30. Let me tell you what's on the outside is helpful, but what's on the inside is what makes a person truly beautiful in God's eyes. And when some lady has both things, husband is really blessed. What kind of a wife does God wish women to be? Well, Paul says wives should show respect for their husbands. Many women find it hard to do that. Some have stereotyped men as crude or juvenile or unworthy of respect. One young lady kept saying, "Oh, they're all dummies," and many other things. And she's still single. Masculinity as a whole has been under attack in our culture. Some actually think that we don't need men at all. But you know what? Humanity could not function or reproduce itself without men. Many men work very hard and sacrifice a great deal to provide for their wives and families. Many men spend hours caring for their wives and children every day. Many men are sensitive and understanding when they need to be and firm when they need to be. Men who love their wives and live the Christian life of honesty and integrity and purity will be men worthy of respect. Some men sadly live without integrity or purity. They treat their wives harshly. And I think how tragic. It's no wonder wives don't respect such men. Why do we say that? Well, how can a wife respect her husband when he doesn't deserve it? She gives him respect both because of who he is and because of who she is. That's why. A man loves his wife because of who he is, even when she's hard to love. Hosea went back to Gomer, and Gomer's a female name, not a male. Hosea went back to Gomer because God said so. And God came to us when we didn't deserve it and forgave us when we wandered away and tried to bring us home. The husbands should love their wives and help them and be what they ought to be. Let's look on page 21, and we're going to go through this one little section, and then we'll talk about the needs of men and women in the beginning tomorrow. What kills love in a marriage? And this is from H. Norman Wright in his book, Secrets of a Lasting Marriage. And he mentions 5 things. Number 1 is a disillusionment. Sometimes people who get married have such high expectations, and when they find out those expectations are not being met, then they feel disappointed. But disillusionment. But you know what? Everybody's imperfect. Everybody's imperfect. I'm imperfect. You're imperfect. Everybody you've ever known is imperfect because we're just people. We're just human. And we have to understand we're marrying imperfect people. And that's okay. That's okay. Sometimes people are disillusioned because they're disappointed. Sometimes because they maybe have doubts or denial, or maybe because they want to blame somebody for doing this or doing that. Somebody's done the wrong thing. And so all of a sudden there's this anger that comes about. They get hurt and their feelings get hurt. They feel lonely, a sense of loss. It's unfair the way I've been treated. And you know what? Sometimes husbands get treated unfairly. Sometimes wives get treated unfairly. And they have to deal with those issues. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Sometimes it's hurt because of thoughts. My needs aren't met. We'll talk about the needs of men and women tomorrow at the 6 o'clock hour. My spouse doesn't understand me. Well, sometimes we have to be honest enough to say, here's what I need from you. And not talk about you don't meet my needs, but here's what I need from you. Sometimes guys just don't know what the wives need, and sometimes wives don't know what the husband needs. And sometimes we just have to be honest with each other to speak. Then there's behavior. Let me tell you something. Complaining to somebody who's not your spouse doesn't always help your marriage unless you can find a way to talk to your spouse and deal with it. I don't want everybody to know every problem I have with Jackie Lynn. I only call her Jackie Lynn once in a while because I did when we were dating. Anger, disillusion, hurt, and then there's anger. Rah, 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 rah. Now you can get to where you're a bulldog and that's all you are, and it's pretty hard to love a bulldog when a bulldog's growling at you. Thoughts can be tough, constant blame, constant carping, constant criticism, constant contention, constant this, constant that. All of this can really make it where, like a fellow told me one time, I think I've fallen out of love with my wife. Then there's ambivalence. That is, you just get to the point where you don't care, where you sense the turmoil is there and you just rather kind of want to avoid it, where you don't know whether you have that. You begin to wonder about finding some other source of relationship. Sometimes people seek counseling, or maybe they talk to their friends, but it gets to the point where they are not talking to their spouse the way they need to. And the time does come whenever these other phases take place that you can have a situation where you have a death of love. You know, some of these same things that I'm talking about, the reason why people leave church. You ever thought about that? The same thing that I'm talking about are reasons why people leave their job, quit their job, why they quit some organization they've been a part of. The death of love, the feelings, they become indifferent, detachment, they have other things on their mind. They think things are going to always be the same way and nothing will change, and so they give up any hope of change. Nothing's going to help. And so they figure the only way I can be happy is just to get away from it. And that's a choice that is unfortunate and hurts a lot of people. We'll talk about the needs of men and women. We'll talk about how to keep marriages together tomorrow night. A lot of those kinds of things that I think will be quite valuable. I don't want you to think everything is negative. You know, the wonderful thing about God is that God not only helps us to see ourselves, but also gives answers. God gives answers in His Word to the problems of life. And it is the greatest book that was ever written about relationships, about how to love, about how to work with people. These are things that are just such an important thing. Okay, we will start on page 21 tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. And so if you come at 7, you'll miss that first discussion. Let's end with